Hi, let me ask you a question. In a sales call, what's more important, being really good at asking discovery questions or being really good at asking questions that create influence? Well, it turns out that in our book, we think discovery questions are important, but more important is the ultimate goal of a sales call, which is to create influence. And I'm going to share my slides and move myself out of the way here. Questions that influence there's actually a set of 4 question types that we can construct. And those question types, because of the way that they're constructed, actually create influence all on their own. Now, it turns out they can also be discovery questions, so they can do double duty, as long as we keep in mind that the primary objective of these questions is to create influence, because that's the primary objective of the sales call. We want to influence the prospect to make the right decision for themselves, which we hope is to buy our product. And we're going to try and influence the prospect to do that. So, how did all this stuff start? Well, my interest in this began years ago when there were a number of scientific studies that looked at how faulty our memory is. And this idea that we don't remember correctly intrigued Daniel Kahneman, who is a psychologist, and he did a number of experiments around emotions and memory that allowed him to develop a theory that we can now utilize. And he did a set of experiments I call the water torture experiments. He had subjects come into a room, put one of their hands in a bucket of really cold water, and keep their hand in that cold water, while with their other hand, they registered on a discomfort meter how uncomfortable it was. After a period of time, had them pull their hand out, go into another room, do a personality inventory, which was just a diversion for about 7 minutes, come back into the room, and this time put their other hand in a bucket of exactly the same temperature cold water, exactly for the same length of time, again registering on the discomfort meter how uncomfortable it was. But instead of having them pull their hand out at the end of that initial period, had them hold their hand in that bucket of ice cold water for an additional period of time, during which time they pumped in a little bit warmer water, raising the overall temperature of the bucket by 1 degree. Turns out we're very sensitive to temperature change. And when we looked at the first part of the first 2 trials, which was 60 seconds long, on the discomfort meter, which ranged from 1 to 14, everybody was right around the 8.3, 8.4 mark in both trials. But in the end of the second trial, where they kept their hand in the water while it was warmed up, the discomfort meter went down to 6.8. Still uncomfortable, but not as uncomfortable. Had them go out of the room. This time they came back in. Again, they were going to put a hand in the bucket of cold water, but they were given the choice. They could do it the first way or the second way. And the subjects weren't told about the 60 seconds and the 90 seconds, right? The first way, 60 seconds of pain. The second way, the same 60 seconds of pain plus an additional 30 seconds of pain. And, the logical choice is you choose the less pain, or actually you might just say, I'm not going to do it at all. But of course, that's not part of a scientific study. It turns out that the vast majority of people picked the second way, the more painful way, because it ended better. It had a better ending. It turns out that we're not sensitive to duration, but we are sensitive to our emotions. So that led Kahneman to do other experiments, but ultimately to formulate a theory that said we can influence how people remember something by making a better ending and making that a big peak at the end. Now, lots of people have done studies around this idea of creating a peak during an experiment, and there's some people that say what matters is how big the peak is during the experience, and other people say no, what matters is that the peak is at the end. And it turns out that all of them agree that if you put the big peak at the end, it will greatly influence how somebody remembers a particular experience. And they wanted to put this to good use. And so Kahneman had a friend who was a doctor who did colonoscopies, and they had 680 some people that were scheduled for colonoscopies volunteer to be part of a study. Half of them got a regular colonoscopy, and half of them got a slightly modified colonoscopy. Now, this was done back in the 1990s, and in the 1990s, when you got a colonoscopy, you were fully awake through the whole thing, and you remembered that experience. And the problem with that was that they wanted patients to come back every 5 years. And with the experience being so bad, many people didn't come back 5 years later for their second colonoscopy. And that mattered medically because if you detect colon cancer early enough, it's quite easy to cure. And so they wanted to see if they could influence this return rate. Now, the difference between the two versions of the colonoscopy that were given in the experiment was one was regular, the other one had an additional 15 seconds added onto it. The regular colonoscopy, they do the exam and then they pull the instrument right out. So it's discomfort all the way to the end. With the modified, they withdrew the instrument down to almost taking it out, but leaving it in for an additional 15 seconds unmanipulated and then removing it. A much better ending. And they wanted to see the influence. Well, the influence was pretty substantial. What happened was they waited 6 years because it was a 5-year return rate, so they wanted to give patients ample time to come back. And they found that the patients that got that 15-second longer colonoscopy came back 41% more, which has a big medical impact because that meant you were catching 41% more colon cancers. So that led him to create this theory that if we can create a big peak at the end, we can influence certain kinds of experiences. And a sales call is exactly the kind of experience that Kahneman was talking about. So he formulated the peak end rule, and we're going to utilize that in a sales call. So we thought, okay, we want to create a big peak at the end. How do we do that? We thought, okay, what we'll do is we'll save our best story for the end of the sales call, or we'll save our very best joke for the end of the sales call, right? Well, it turns out that some fMRI studies were done on peaks and how the brain responds during peaks. Turns out that the stronger the peak, the stronger the brain activity, or the stronger the brain activity, the stronger the peak. And so we thought, okay, great, we want a very active brain. And then we looked at further fMRI studies, and it turns out that fMRI studies show that our brain is 4 times more active when we're talking than when we're listening. So we thought, okay, we want to create this peak for our prospect while the prospect's doing the talking. How do we do that? Well, that was a difficult one to figure out, but of course we did, or I wouldn't be talking to you, right? We do it through asking a question, and we wanted to ask a question that got the prospect to talk about something they love to talk about. And what is our favorite subject? Well, we knew at the time, this was 10 years ago, we knew at the time that reports on what people talked about in social media was that 80% of the time, the posts were about themselves. Turns out we love to talk about ourselves. Selfies is a great example of that. Well, I wrote a book called The Peak Interview, which was how you use this in a job interview. 3 years after that book came out, Harvard decided to do a study that would verify one way or the other whether this was true, that we really love to talk about ourselves. And they did, under fMRI, they had people talk about themselves and then talk about the person they most greatly admired. And it turns out that in both cases, the brain lights up, but lights up way more when we're talking about ourselves. So let's formulate a question that gets us to talk about ourselves, but not just about ourselves in an instance where we're really engaged, where we really are energetic about that. So the question is really simple. You wait until you're absolutely at the end of your sales call, and you've done all your housekeeping. Now you're going to have an afterthought. Oh, before I go, I have one question I've just been dying to ask you, because clearly you're an interesting person. You've had an interesting career. Tell me, what's the one thing you've done in your career that you're most proud of? Now, you make the question your own, right? You don't have to use that exact question, but you want to get them to talk about something that they're proud of. And it may have been during your discovery, you found something that you knew they would want to talk about, and you can ask them a question about that. Your job from that point on is to listen and to encourage. When they're done with their story, and sometimes it's more than one story, and sometimes it can go a fair distance, the longer it goes, the stronger the bond is that they will create with you. It turns out that we bond quite nicely with people who really listen to us, and that's what you're doing. And no matter how much their story is just like something you've done, keep that to yourself. You'll get a chance to interact with this person again. And at that point, you can tell your story. This is their moment to shine, and let them have it. When they're done, stick out your hand, shake their hand, say, thank you. I'm so glad I asked this question. This has been absolutely fascinating. And then when you send a thank you note to them, remind them that you'd love to see them again because you'd like to ask them more about whatever it is they talked about in answer to that question. So we've actually tested this thing for about 10 years. We tested it in the most consequential sales environment there is, which is the job interview, because that really matters to the candidate going for the job. And we've had experienced CEOs and freshly minted college students use this question, now really thousands of them. And the report comes back that they attribute to getting the offer to this question and one other question, which is one of the 4 questions that I mentioned. Anyway, we've tested it all over the world. It works very well. So I encourage you, go out, try this question. It will work for you, and you'll see the power of it. If you want to learn the other 3 questions, come back. There's my email address on the slide, and get in contact with me. I have a little 5-week seminar. It's really an easy seminar to take because it's spread out, and you only have to come back in occasionally during those 5 weeks to participate. But you get all 4 questions. You learn why they work, how to use them, how to construct them, and how to be most effective. Anyway, good luck. Thank you.